So you ever do something and the experience didn't match your expectations for it? As many of you know, I went to God's School, the University of Miami down in Florida for college. And before that time, before getting there, I would have considered myself a casual fan of the football program. I mean, I would watch them on TV because I just loved the Orange Bowl where they played at that time. And they were always really good, and I would just kind of follow how they did and all that stuff. But when I got down there to go to school, I could not wait to go to my first game at the Orange Bowl. They hardly ever lost there. They were actually on a streak where it became the all-time home winning streak in the NCAA. It still is. And they had this really cool entryway or entrance of the players where these fire extinguishers went off. It's now made popular around college football programs all over the place, but it started there. And so it was this really cool entryway. I couldn't wait to see that and all that stuff. And so the first game I got to go to was a nationally televised Thursday night game. And it was the number 10 University of Houston Cougars, or the anti-God team, in my opinion, versus the number 2 University of Miami Hurricanes. And like I said, it was a big night, and I can still remember, because we prepared all day to go to the game as students, we may have missed some classes and all that stuff, but I can still remember, kind of preparing for the game, and I just remember the first time I walked into the Orange Bowl. And I walk in there, it was like, oh man, it was like a moment, man. It was like all the senses, it just engaged at that moment. It was like, I was just watching these players, and they're warming up, and I'm like, man, these are athletes. And I could just feel the intensity from the crowd, that they knew it was a big game. I could hear all these different sounds of just, being in the stadium. And it just smelled, I don't know how to describe this, it just smelled like a big game. Well, the fire extinguishers went off, and the players come running out, and the place goes nuts, and they went nuts there, and they didn't stop going nuts for the rest of the game because they pounded the living daylights out of those chumps. It was 40-10. I mean, it was amazing, and I tell you what, I had such a great experience at that game. From there, I never missed a game at the Orange Bowl from there. All because there was just something about being in the stadium, something about being at the game that made me never want to miss. Now today we are wrapping up Live Big 2024, and if you're new or you're not a Jesus follower, Live Big is one of the most impactful things we do as a church. Just a little bit about it. We take 3 weeks out of the year on an annual basis, and we challenge our entire church, kids and students, everybody who's a part of what's going on here, and we challenge them to a season of sacrificial generosity, and 100% of it goes to helping those in need. Now, as we kind of wrap up the series part of Live Big, the window to give financially will remain open until the end of the month. And so here's the QR code. If you want to scan this QR code at your seats, you also have Live Big card with the QR code on the back, and it has everything Live Big as a part of it. And here's what's cool about Live Big this year. I mean, we've already started to see the impact of what God does through Live Big. I mean, we packed 150,000 meals last weekend. All of them went to help those in need in our community. We are going to provide hats, gloves, and coats for 1,500 students that, and what perfect time, we talk about winter coming, that will not have those things this winter as we partner with 4 school districts in our area. Winter Wonderfest, as both campus pastors have talked about Winter Wonderfest, we will serve over 1,500 kids that are living below the poverty line. And as you look at the wish list, as you scan the QR code, man, you will see job initiatives, staff hirings, purchasing new equipment, expansion programs for great nonprofits that are helping those in need. So can I just encourage you, give generously. The wish list has hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of stuff, man. Let's go after it and meet as many of those as possible. Now, before I talk about what I want to talk about today, I want to set it up by talking about something that Jesus said that is very convicting. And here's the background. Jesus is telling a series of parables, actually tells 3 of them, and in this last one, he talks about a king, sheep, and goats. And Jesus is the king, and the sheep are the ones who are invited to be a part of the king's kingdom, and the goats are not. And Jesus gets to near the end of his story, and he gives the main reason why the sheep are invited in. And here's what Jesus says. He says, "Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father. take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. And listen to what he says. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. Well, then the righteous, who are the sheep, will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? And the king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine. And if you were here week 1, we talked about who the least of these are. These are people in need. These are the orphans. These are the widows. These are the poor. And he says, whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. And so the convicting part of this is that Jesus personalizes this. Jesus is saying, hey, when you care for the least of these, you are actually doing it for me. And when we hear this, it's interesting, we actually think the very same way. I have a wife and 3 kids, and if you were around my wife and 3 kids and you cared for them, you would actually be caring for me because of what they mean to me. To follow Jesus is to have the heart of Jesus. And according to Jesus, one of the ways we know we have his heart is when we prioritize caring for the least of these. Let me let you in on a little secret. I've never said this before in the 10 years. This is our 10th anniversary of doing Live Big. I've never said this in the 10 years of doing Live Big. Our primary reason for doing Live Big isn't to help those in need. Rather, our primary reason for doing Live Big is to develop Jesus's heart for the least of these. And if we do that, guess what will happen? We will serve more people in need. But here's the challenge, and here's where I want to go with the message today. And we scratched the surface of this in week 1, and we talked about it from a giving side, but what I want to do is I want to go even further down this, and I want to talk about this from a serving side of things. Jesus's heart is for the least of these. But study after study shows that very few of us, actually about 10% of us, naturally gravitate towards giving and serving towards the least of these. Very few of us do that. And you don't have to be very good at math to go, okay, 10% do, that means 90% of us don't. Now, if you're wondering, hey, am I in the 90%? I wonder if I'm on 9 out of 10. Here's a question that'll help you filter through if you are in the 90%. And I think this is a good question that we should wrestle and be honest with ourselves about. When we do Live Big, even this year, when we did Live Big, what's your honest reaction? And if your reaction was, hey, I can't wait to be a part of what God's doing through this. Hey, I can't wait to get with my family, and we're going to talk about what we're going to sacrifice and what we're going to give up. We're going to change some things about our everyday lifestyle so we can sacrifice for those in need. And I can't wait to see the number of people that we are able to step in and make an impact in our life. If that is your reaction and you're moving towards that and you're drawing towards that, you're in the 10%. But if your reaction was, and it was indifferent, if it was like, I'll throw a few bucks and, I'll serve at Winter Wonderfest, or I'll do this, and your reaction is this attitude of, what is the minimum I can do to just kind of get by or to check it off the list and all that stuff? Hey, listen, you are probably in the 90%. And so let me just say this. If you are in the 90% like me, you don't have to feel guilty or shame about that, but I want to challenge you to own it. I want to challenge you to be honest about it, because here's the question I want us to tackle in this message. How can we develop Jesus's heart for the least of these? How can we do that? And the key word is develop, because develop is something that we grow into. Develop is a process we go through where we put ourselves in a position for God to change our heart. And here's how we know that we begin to have his heart. It's not how we feel. Is our heart moved to action? I want to share with you 2 personal stories that God has used in my life, because as I said, I am actually in that 90%. I don't naturally gravitate in this direction, and so this is tough for me. This is always a challenge for me, but I want to use these stories because I'm in that 90%. The first story happened years ago, and I was serving on staff at a church in Kentucky, and I was asked to go on a mission trip to the Dominican Republic. And I had never gone on a mission trip before. And there was many reasons why I never went on one, but if I was just going to be really candid with you, there are really two main reasons. One of them was fear. I was afraid of what I was going to see or experience, and I just knew I'd be uncomfortable with the whole thing. And then the other one was honestly just selfishness. I didn't want to be uncomfortable, and I didn't want to see those things because I knew that I would be faced with some things, and so I didn't want to do it. But the trip that we were going to go on, we were actually going to do this, put on a basketball clinic for kids in this very impoverished community. And then after that at night, our team was actually going to play against some of the Dominican national teams. And so I'm like, oh man, coach and play basketball? I don't even know if that's considered a mission trip, but man, I'm in on that. So I get there, and honestly, I was not prepared for what I was experiencing. Doing the basketball clinic, the kids that we were able to coach and have fun with, there were some that the only set of clothes that they had was what they were wearing there. Some of them didn't have shirts, their shoes. Most of them had holes in it. Some of them really didn't have bottoms attached to it. And the meal that we served them, that was probably the only meal that they were getting that day. And the homes that they were going back to, we just knew that they weren't good homes. As a part of the trip, I volunteered to go with a group of the people that we were with to this place in the Dominican called The Hole. And I didn't know what The Hole was. And I soon discovered when we arrived there, The Hole was a giant garbage dump that people lived. And they built their homes there, and there's kids there. And there's this stream of water, if you can see in the pictures, that goes down there. And what that water is that's waste from the city that goes down that garbage dump where the families that live there, they drink every single day. In other words, they are literally killing themselves every time they get a drink of water. And I have never seen or smelt anything like that in my life. And when I was going back to the United States, flying back, I remember just sitting in the plane going, God, what do I do with that? Because I can't unsee that. The second story happened years later. We had started the Ridge, and we were partnering with this time at the Salvation Army in downtown Milwaukee. And it was the summertime, and because there was no school, that meant no free lunches, and so there was a lot of kids that didn't get lunches because, once again, it was the summertime. And so we partnered with the Salvation Army because they needed supplies, and then they needed people to make the lunches and then serve the lunches. And as always, our church stepped in and they did that. Well, I was at one of the serving days, and one of the ladies who was on staff at the Salvation Army, she'd been on staff for 25 years. She comes up to me, she goes, hey, I want to give you a tour of Milwaukee. I'm like, I know my way around Milwaukee. You don't have to give me a tour. She goes, no. You don't know this part of Milwaukee. I want you to go on a tour with me. So my wife and our 3 kids, we hopped in a van, and for the next 2 hours, she showed me parts of Milwaukee that I did not know that existed. She showed me parts. These weren't just places of poverty. She showed me a behind-the-scenes view of things that were driving and causing the poverty. And she introduced me to these things called poverty cycles. These are things that just facilitate poverty time and time again. And I remember as we just got into the car and we're driving home, and I just remember thinking, God, well, what do I do with that? Because I can't unsee that. Why do I tell you those 2 stories? God used those 2 experiences to begin to change my heart for the least of these. And the way he did it, and I didn't know it when this was going on, okay? But the way he did it is he used a principle in my life that if you allow him to leverage it in your life, I am telling you what, he will do the very same thing for you. He will begin to shift your heart towards the least of these as he is mine. And this principle is called the proximity principle. And here's what the proximity principle says. Proximity changes perspective and priorities. Proximity changes perspective and priorities. And so what the proximity principle says is this. It says, the closer we get to something, that by being there, it has the potential to change how we see things, and then as a result, how we act or how we respond towards things. And so I'm a casual University of Miami fan before I go to school there, and then I experience a game at the Orange Bowl, and I go from casual to a committed fan, and I never miss a game from there. Before going to the Dominican, didn't really care about poverty. I go to the Dominican, and I come back, and not only do I care about poverty, but as a result, our church builds a feeding center and plants a church right in the middle of the whole. Before going on that tour, in downtown Milwaukee, I didn't care about poverty cycles. And if you would have told me about it back then, I would have said, man, the government can deal with that. They're equipped to deal with that. I go on that tour, I come back, and that trip becomes one of the driving things that formed Live Big, because we partner with organizations that break poverty cycles. The proximity principle. Proximity changes perspective and priorities. And so as a part of this message, we're going to do some interaction. And so I'm going to count to 3, and I just want you to say the principle with me. All right, you ready? 1, 2, 3. Proximity changes perspective and priorities. Do it again. Proximity changes perspective and priorities. Now, hear me on this. I don't tell you those stories to highlight me. I tell you those stories because if God can use those stories to change my heart for the least of these, and I've seen him do it in many other lives, I'm telling you what, if you are in that 90%, he can do it to change yours as well. The proximity principle. Now, just a side note on the proximity principle. This has not worked being around Packer fans for me, okay? It has not worked. It has not changed my view to become a Packer fan. In fact, it's gone the opposite direction, okay? So for some reason, there's an exception with all principles, and that's one right there. Now, Jesus, this is great. Jesus talked about the importance of proximity to change our heart time and time again. In fact, in the most popular story that he told, the Good Samaritan, most of us have heard the Good Samaritan before, he uses proximity as the way to drive his point to redefine who our neighbor is. And most of us, as I said, we've heard the story before, and we know that it starts out with the 2 religious leaders, and you have the priest and the Levite, and they see the guy in need, and they don't go close to him and said, they actually go away from him. And then we get introduced to the Samaritan, and the Samaritan responds in a very different way. Here's what Jesus says about the Samaritan. He says, but a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, in other words, he saw the same thing the other 2 did, he took pity on him. Now, the interesting thing about pity is a perspective thing. Pity is how we see things. Pity isn't, I feel bad about stuff, and because I feel bad about stuff, I feel good about me. That's how most of us see pity. But what pity is it moves our heart to the point where it moves us to do something about it. And he says he took pity on him, and then notice what he does. He went to him. There's the proximity thing right there. And notice all the things he does by going to the man. It says he bandaged his wounds, pouring oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, there it is again. When I return, I will reimburse you for extra expense you may have. So he doesn't just write a check and say, take care of him. Instead, he goes, nope, here's some money. And guess what? I'll be back again. And so in the Good Samaritan, Jesus gives us this picture of what our lives should look like when our priorities align with his perspective. Proximity changes our perspective and priorities. Proximity changes our perspective and priorities. So here's what I'll do with the few minutes I have left. I want to break down how proximity changes those things and what we need to do to allow that process and to God to use that process in our lives. And my prayer is that you would be open. If you are in the 90%, and here's the thing, and 9 out of 10 of us are, and it's okay, that you would be open to allow God to just kind of move your heart in this direction. All right, let's break it down. So proximity changes our perspective. Perspective is all about how we see things. And we all have a perspective. We all have a way that we see the world. Now, what's true of all of us, and this is where the problem is that our perspective is limited to our experiences. We only know what we know. And we only know what we know because of what we've been exposed to. Or this is a big thing nowadays. by what we allow ourselves to be exposed to. And because of that, here is a big challenge every single one of us has if we want to follow Jesus. Not believe in Jesus, but actually follow Jesus. His perspective is often not our perspective. That the way Jesus sees things conflicts with the way we see things. And a big part of spiritual growth is God wants to take our perspective and move it so it becomes His perspective. And every time He tries to do that in our life, it creates tension. Do you know what the main cause of that tension is? And it's the same thing for every single one of us. It's a P word. Pride. We think our perspective is the right perspective. And if you don't believe me, just go on social media for 10 minutes because you'll see everybody giving their opinion on things, but it's really their perspective. And here's the thing, if you notice, they are always right. And there's no critical thinking or discussion on social media because everybody's giving their perspective and their perspective is the perspective. And let's be honest, we don't like to admit that our perspective might be wrong. One of the things that I get made fun of around here, it's really from staff, and they do it behind my back because if they do it to me, I'd fire all of them, and all that stuff. No, I'm just kidding. I wouldn't do that, except for Tyler. I'd do that for. One of the things that I get made fun of is my love for kitty cats. Now, when Donna and I were dating, I wanted to get a dog. And she said, you don't want to get a dog, and you're not going to get a dog because you're living by yourself and you're never going to be home. And I said, honey, I got a dog picked out and all that stuff. You're not going to get a dog. And she said, you're going to get a cat. And I said, I'm not getting a cat because cats are mean and cats are boring. And she challenged my perspective and she said, how do you know because you've never had one? Since I wanted to stay dating Donna, the next day we went to the Humane Society where I saw this little kitty and he was hanging from the cage and he was swinging back and forth and I said, I want him. So I took him home and let me just say this, spending many years with that kitten, he wasn't mean, he wasn't boring, he was fun, he was playful, I could train him to do things, he had this charismatic personality. I had to admit my perspective was wrong. In fact, it's been so wrong over the last 6 months, we have been catless because we had to put some down. We just adopted siblings right here. Look at that right there. It's a great picture, isn't it? I know, it's just a great picture. Yeah, it's a great picture. And so what, I blame Donna for that change in perspective because that's all her fault. Pride keeps us from allowing God to challenge and change our perspective. But here's why this is so important for us. In fact, here's why this is so essential for us. Your greatest spiritual breakthroughs are through your pride. Your greatest spiritual breakthroughs are through your pride. Every time. I want you to think about the last significant step you took spiritually. And if you can't think about it, that's something that you probably need to wrestle with. But think back to your last one. I guarantee you before you took that step, there was all these excuses that kept you from taking that step. And you justified them and all that stuff. But the thing that was driving those excuses were the same thing every single time. Your pride. This is why I actually created this phrase that I say to myself every time I feel that tension where God's perspective is conflicting with my perspective, and I feel that tension, and I say this phrase to myself. And here's what I say to myself. Okay, Mark, just pitch the pride. Pitch the pride. Throw it out. Ignore it. It's not there to help you. It is keeping you from a breakthrough. And so I want to encourage you the next time you're in a service or you're in a Ridge group or you're having a conversation with another Jesus follower and is pushing against one of your perspectives and you're starting to feel that tension, here's what I just want you to do. I want you to talk to yourself. And here's what I want you to say to yourself. Just say whatever your name is, just pitch the pride. Pitch the pride. And so we're going to practice that right now. I'm going to count to 3, and you're going to say your name, not your name, okay, like that. You're going to actually say what your name is, okay? And then pitch the pride. You ready? Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Do it one more time. Mark, pitch the pride. Now, if you didn't say that, you really need to say it, okay? Because pride is keeping you from saying it. And here's the thing. This is hard. All right, it's so easy to talk about when this happens in our life. This is so hard. But the reason why you want to allow God to change your perspective is because his perspective will always move you to his purposes. And for every single one of us, on the other side of your pride, God has something significant for you to do. And I don't know what it is, but whatever it is, it's important to him, because what we do for them, we are doing for him. So proximity changes our perspective, but it also changes our priorities. Now, here's the interesting thing about priorities. Perspective and priorities are very much connected. How we see things determines many of the decisions that we make. But as God begins to change our perspective, part of the tension we're going to feel is our current priorities don't align with our new perspective. I see this all the time when I meet with married couples who are struggling. And they'll sit down in my office, and right away I'll begin to talk to them about God's perspective for marriage. And I'll say, God has a larger story in mind. Your story is not the most important. It's his, and his story is meant to be lived through you. And I'll talk about putting the other person first in everything that we do. And then I'll say, do you want that? And they'll say, yeah, I want that. I want that perspective. I'll say, okay. And then I'll give them some next steps. And here's what happens almost every single time as they leave my office. Eventually they come back, and as they come back, they say, well, that worked for a while. That doesn't work anymore. And here's the problem. The problem isn't that it doesn't work. The problem is that they have not yet reached the point where they decided to change their priorities to align with their new perspective. And so when we don't do that, we default back to our old ways of doing things. And so when it comes to our perspective, we said, okay, if we want to allow God to change that, we need to pitch the pride. Well, so what do we do with our perspective, and do we change that? What do we do there? Well, the way that we change our perspective to our priorities to align with our perspective is we need to decide to reprioritize. That we need to begin to make decisions in our life that we weren't making before. And that's something very few of us do, because it means we have to trust, and it's always going to feel extreme at first. Let me give you an example of this. I see this time and time again. This was my story as well. I see this time and time again when it comes to the idea of God and our money. And so we make a decision to follow Jesus, and we still bring in our perspective and our priority of money, and then we talk about money, and we talk about it always from God's perspective. And our perspective is, that's my money, don't touch my money. And then we see that God's perspective is, no, it's not your money, it's his, and as we talked about in week 1, we are stewards of that. Now, if we're willing to pitch our pride and surrender our perspective to God's perspective, there's still tension there. And the tension is because there's another step to take. And the step to take is we got to make a decision when it comes to our finances to actually put God first in our finances. And when you begin to move in that direction and make those decisions, it'll be like, now I actually got to trust. And I'm telling you, you'll feel like it is so extreme, this is so much money, and you'll go through all those things. But I'm telling you, when you do, you will see God work and your heart change in the area of money in your life. This is why Live Big is so important for us individually and as a church. For many of you who are in that 90%, you're serving and you're giving, and you're putting yourself in proximity of people. And here's what you don't even realize, that your perspective on the least of these is already beginning to change. You don't hold some of the beliefs, and you don't hold some of the opinions that you did before, but there's still tension that you're feeling, and you don't know what that tension is. And that tension is in the form of a question like this: what does it mean for you to decide to truly prioritize the least of these during a season like Live Big, and maybe even beyond that? I'm telling you, when you begin to take steps and you begin to change your perspective change your priorities so they align with God's perspective, God will do a work in your heart where you'll begin to develop a heart for the least of these, and you'll go, I didn't even know that was possible. Proximity changes perspective and priorities. This is a spiritual principle. You want God to change your heart in any area of your life, this principle will do it. You want him to change towards dating and marriage and parenting and finances and politics and social issues and money, whatever it is, this principle will work. But we are in Live Big season, and so our total focus is on leveraging this principle to have God's heart for the least of these. And so I want to wrap up Live Big 2024 by asking you 2 questions. And the first one is going to seem like the easiest, but I think it is the most challenging question of the 2. And the question is, are you in the 90%? Are you in the 90%? And I'm just asking you to be honest with yourself. And it's okay to be honest. There is freedom in the honesty. I mean, 90% of us are. And here's the thing, God already knows. He already knows. And you can't defeat what you don't define. Are you in the 90%? And if you go, honestly, I'm in the 90%, well, then you open yourself up to what is next. And the second question is, what steps do you need to take to leverage this principle? What do you need to do to put yourself in a position that God can begin to change your perspective, and then as a result, to begin to realign your priorities to match his perspective? What do you need to do? What steps do you need to take? And this is why Live Big is so great. There's so many great opportunities to serve. We have, as we said, the 2 Winter Wonder Fests coming up, which are going to be really important. And we need hundreds and hundreds of people to serve there. And if you serve there or someone else in one of our partners, wherever it may be, here's what I want you to do. Don't just check the box. I want you to get close to the people that you are serving. And here's what you're going to discover. They are human beings that are made in the image of God. And they have hopes and dreams just like you do. Now, for some of you, you're doing that and you're continuing to do that and you're taking steps there. And so there's another step for you to take. And the step I want to challenge you to take is I want you to get on a plane next year and I want you to go on a mission trip. Now, some of you are going like, well, wait, that's going to cost me something. Yeah, it's going to. And you know what? The return will be far greater than any cost you put into it. I'm telling you, you do that, you will put yourself in proximity to needs and things like that, that you will come back and your perspective will be different, and as a result, you will wrestle with the tension like I did of what does this mean for me going forward. Now, what's great as a part of Live Big, we have actually a string of mission trips that we are doing next year. And you can scan the Live Big QR code. And actually next week, we are going to have some meetings that's actually on, it's part of their Live Big page. We're going to have some meetings. We actually have a mission trip that we're going to do for high school students. Man, send your high school students on a mission trip. It'll be, Mom and Dad, one of the best things that you could do for your students. And go on one yourself. We got a bunch of them. Check out the meeting next week. And man, I hope we just get a bunch of people on a plane, going to another country, and just allowing God to change their perspective and ultimately their priorities. Now, I want to wrap up Live Big with this. Do you know what makes Christianity so amazing? I mean, there's a lot of things, okay? But one of the things that separates it from any other religion in the world is that God saw our poverty. He saw our need and our sin debt and our need for forgiveness of sin, and he didn't send a third party, he didn't send someone else, he didn't just write a check and send it. In other words, he came himself. It's what we will celebrate at Christmas in a few weeks. And the writer of Hebrews, he just says it this way. He says, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weakness, but we have one who is tempted in every way just as we are, because he was here with us. Yet he did not sin. Let's then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our what? Our time of need." It's why every time we approach God and we go, "God, help," he says, "I will, and I understand." Just as he came for us in our greatest need, he invites us to do the very same thing for others. And so as we wrap up Live Big, if you got signed up, you serve somewhere and you serve sacrificially. And if you haven't given, you give financially, sacrificially. And I hope that we meet thousands of needs in our community. But more importantly, when you do this, my prayer is that you will begin to develop Jesus' heart for the least of these, because when we do it for them, It's very, very personal to God because we are actually doing it for him and to him. Let me pray for us. Father, as we come to at least from a series standpoint, we come to the end of year 10 of Live Big. I still can't get over that year 10. We're grateful for just what you've allowed us to be a part of. But God, as we kind of finish up this year, and there's so many opportunities left for us to step into, God, may we first just kind of lay our hearts before you and go, yeah, I'm in the 90. I'm in the 90, God, if I'm really honest. It just not there. And God, you already know, and what's great about it is you're just waiting for us to be honest and come to you and to take the steps accordingly. And so, God, I pray that every single one of us that's in that 90%, that we would serve somewhere, we would give somewhere, and we would be completely open because we're there in the trenches, that you would give us a fresh perspective, your perspective. And as a result, we would leave with the tension of, all right, what does this mean for me? And we wouldn't shy away from that. We would lean into that. And Father, I know something that you want to do in your church is you want to place your deep, abiding heart for the least of these in our church. And may that actually happen, God. May it be a place where you go, oh yeah, you guys are getting it. You guys are getting it. You guys are getting it. God, we're open to that. Do something in that. We thank you for the privilege of serving all the people that we get to serve over this next season. And we thank you for the privilege of giving for them as well. And God, thank you that it's very personal for you. Because what we do for them, we are actually doing it to you. Thank you, God, for it. And we pray this in your name. Amen.